So everyone's excited for a new phone, but what phone could it be? It could be this one, or maybe this one. Or it could be the exact same phone as last year. And the year before that. And the year before that. Most people don't think iPhones change year over year because most people don't notice the minor technical improvements. Like, I'm sorry, Gregory, but your mom's probably not going to know what an LCPO display is. So to get the general public to consume, Apple makes changes that regular people feel like they have to have, like titanium or the dynamic island. But the bigger hook are things like iMessage, FaceTime, and AirDrop, which are only in Apple's ecosystem. Things you have to have Apple products in their workflow. Or to be accepted. If there's anything Apple's good at, it's marketing. They could sell you a literal overpriced polishing cloth and y'all would still fall for it. And that's why I think it's fascinating when we go back about 40 years in Apple's history, because let's face it, they were almost a completely different company. In 1995, they fired Steve Jobs because he was too young and they didn't agree with his decisions. So then they replaced him with true wise old man experience. Yeah, so it turns out that without Steve Jobs to give the company unique ideas to set themselves apart from the competition, they just ended up making their lineup of products crowded. Their products were also way more expensive than cheaper and better performing PCs. But by 1993, Apple had gotten so desperate they had to sin. They ended up licensing their software to other companies to make their money in market share, which would have never happened if Steve Jobs was around. He always believed in having a tight integration between hardware and software, and this belief is clearly seen in Apple to this day. But sinning once can only take you so far. Sure, licensing software was enough to keep Apple running for a while, but they needed more money. So you know what that means? It's time to sin big. You know what they say? Sin big or kill yourself. They just couldn't help but capitalize, because that's always the answer. They started cloning Mac hardware too. They gave companies a simpler version of their hardware to use for almost whatever they wanted, which would later lead to the creation of the Apple Pippin, and they would use this platform to give you a Mac experience on your TV. Apple made the internals and the licensees got to design the exterior and everything else. They're literally shaped the exact same but just with different colors. Aside from these two labels, they're almost indistinguishable. Bandai, yes that Bandai, is the most well-known licensee. They wanted a simpler version of macOS to use for CD-based games, and they wanted to launch in Japan and North America, so they asked Apple in 1994 on the idea. The licensees could improve the hardware Apple gave them by adding more RAM and improving the video and audio performance. They never did. They based the Pippin off of Macs from the early 90s, and Bandai wanted to market the system as a game console with its own high-quality games and games ported from the Mac. They also wanted this in there too. But the Pippin didn't have a dedicated GPU. I get that macOS didn't need it, it just wasn't necessary, but come on man. That's like making a very powerful phone, but then underclocking it from the factory with no way to unleash its actual power. They would later encourage developers to make 3D modeling software so the CPU didn't have to process that too. That chicken guess would fix that issue. Apple didn't originally intend on including internet, but later research would prove that people would appreciate if the Pippin had internet. What research did they do? Almost no one had internet in the 90s, so why would they include something that nobody had access to or even knew how to use? You couldn't even make the excuse that they didn't want to cram it in later because the Pippin was upgradable. They announced a partnership in 1994 at the Tokyo Toy Show, while showing a prototype with the Pippin in 1995. Video games weren't as big as they are today, so video games were shown at the toy and consumer electronics shows, with things like E3 to come later. Sega would use this chance to show off the Sega Saturn, although it was also in its early stages, so no one had the advantage yet. And oh look, it's their future killer. Bandai said the Pippin would attract people who didn't have computers because of their constant complexity. But Apple didn't allow them to call it a computer. It's a computer. They thought that people would buy it over their Mac desktops, which keep in mind, no one bought. It could have resulted in better sales since it was a computer. There would have been more reason for people to want to buy it, but alas, they just had to reach the level of bankruptcy. Oh man, I'm not on the list! The Apple Pippin came out in Japan in March of 1996 for 64,800 yen, or about $460, but launched in America in June for about $600. The design of the console doesn't make me think game console, but a printer. The black and white colors and row buttons on the front make you think it belongs in a 90s office. The back of the console is way less simpler than its competitors too. A VGA port to hook it up to a monitor while also having an RCA port to hook it up to a TV, a serial port that's connected to a printer. Remember, this is supposed to be a quote-unquote game console, and the two ADB ports on the front for the controllers. Except for the RCA port, all the other ports could be found on regular desktop Macs from the 90s. But with all these connectors here, how is little Timmy supposed to play Museum Madness and learn about science? Now the Pippin's controller might look like the PS3 Boomerang's ancestor, but hear me out here. This is the Applejack controller, and it had the bare essentials for a controller at the time. The 4 face buttons, the D-pad while not looking like one still being one. The look of it makes me want to vomit. My god, it looks so mushy. But hey, which ones did they have? These? No. Of course not. Making you suffer is their #1 priority. There's also 2 shoulder buttons at the top with a trackball in the center. Yeah, the Apple Pippin is one of the few consoles that can actually use this thing because most of its library consisted of ports from the Mac, while having the exact same shape as Sokka's boomerang. But like I said, the games consisted of ports from the Mac and some of them were Bandai's own games. The games weren't region locked, so you can play a Japanese version of the game on an American console, and the other way around. You could use it anywhere in the world since all versions supported NTSC and PAL. The quote-unquote best game according to most people for the Pippin is Power Rangers Zeo. It was a port from the Mac, so you could play it on there and get slightly better results. But the game wasn't good to begin with, so trying to optimize it wouldn't help anyways. And without further ado, I present to you this system's killer app. The hitboxes for the villains were really inaccurate, as you can see, and the game was honestly really boring to many people who played it. It's literally just this gameplay for the entire game. It reminds you of the dinosaur game from Google. It's also worth mentioning that this came out at the same time as Super Mario 64 and Tomb Raider, so this just wasn't gonna cut it. Another game is Marathon, made by Bungie. Apparently they made games only for the Mac in the 90s, and Marathon was a popular one back then. This port isn't a good representation of the game though. If we ran the game on high-res settings, it would look good, but oh, looks like someone stole my frames. If you put it on low-res, the frame rates will be much smoother, but hold on, he's back again. I'll get him this time. For the camera controls, on the desktop version of the game, you could freely move around while aiming and shooting since you were holding a mouse. This is one of the things that made the game popular. But on the Pippin, you couldn't even aim. You just shot straight ahead hoping you hit your enemy. These were the best games the Pippin had to offer, and they didn't justify $600 for a Pippin at all. Most people just bought an N64, a PlayStation, or both, which would still be like $100 cheaper, and they would get a greater library of games and just better value overall. Some bought what is believed to be a Sega Saturn, and there's an estimated 9 million of these specimens out in the wild. Apple will continue to update the Pippin platform throughout like the first year of its launch, and they would just basically add whenever the regular Macs had to keep it up to date. They would announce an updated version for licensees in 1997, which had things like Firewire, but at that time, it was already too late. The Pippin was selling so bad that they stopped selling in the US to be sold in Japan only. Even the Virtual Boy managed to sell more than the Apple Pippin. Let's find out why. Well, gee, I just wanted to experience the nausea feature. Get out of my office right now. Okay, get out. Okay, I understand. I don't want to see you again. Just get out. When Steve Jobs finally came back in 1997, let's just say it was like a parent coming home to see their worst nightmare. Perhaps it's time I put my hands on you. Steve Jobs shut down all of Apple's clones, and Bandai stopped making Pippins worldwide shortly after. Bandai sold all their unsold copies to Daystar Digital. Why? It's better than this, that's for sure. But Apple did keep it supported for about another 5 years, so it was treated like a regular Mac in terms of software. So that is the Apple Pippin. Bandai never really knew who to market the system to. They said it was a game console, but you could print out stuff with it. The Apple Pippin was something only possible because of the state that Apple was in at the time. They just kept throwing things at the wall to see if it would stick, and unfortunately, not even Arthur's computer venture could save them. But you may be asking, how did they get out of bankruptcy so fast? Well, I don't know myself, so let's find out. Microsoft. But why though? So, Microsoft's the reason that Apple survived the 90s. I get that they only did it to not look like a monopoly, but thanks to them, we live in a world you can spend $700 on computer wheels.